a risky royal banquet intended to elevate her non-royal son, Tom Parker B.S., to the highest ranks of international financial aristocracy turned into the most public and humiliating administrative execution she had ever faced. Tom Parker B.S. was far from the pinnacle of power, far from the center. Camilla ordered the unilateral removal of the Duke of Kent, the venerable 90-year-old cousin of the late Queen Elizabeth II, and a living monument to selfless royal duty from his traditional seat of honor beside the king. In his place, she sought to insert her son Tom, deliberately positioning him directly adjacent to the ultra-wealthy financial gatekeepers of the royal family, most notably Lady Sarah Chadow and the multi-billionaire Swiss philanthropist Francesca Schwarzenbach. To achieve this, Camilla's office presented the change as a routine logistical optimization, banking on the assumption that no palace courtier would dare spark an administrative crisis on the eve of a major televised event. In the mind of the Queen, the royal household had finally bent to her domestic hegemony. She treated the ancient apparatus of state protocol as if it were a private dinner party, a personal ledger from which she could freely distribute diplomatic capital to her non-royal offspring. For years, she had relied on King Charles's historical willingness to defy the institution for her sake, operating under the dangerous assumption that the blood royal would simply step aside, too exhausted or too fearful of upsetting the king to challenge her quiet management of the palace's internal geography. But this overreach exposed an astonishing degree of strategic blindness, particularly regarding the behavioral patterns of her son. Emboldened by his mother's apparent omnipotence, Tom Parker B.S. arrived at the Pergola reception lounge operating under the delusion that he was the newly minted arbiter of the court. His conduct within the private quarters of the palace was nothing short of an institutional travesty characterized by an arrogant transactional entitlement that deeply offended the sensibilities of the old aristocracy. Upon entering the VIP lounge, Tom bypassed all established protocol. He walked directly over to the specialized velvet armchair, equipped with orthopedic support cushions reserved exclusively for the frail Duke of Kent, who was navigating the room with a walking stick. Without an ounce of hesitation, Tom slumped into the chair, crossing his legs and loudly conducting a phone call regarding his private luxury brand consultation. When a senior palace steward discreetly approached Tom to remind him of the room's traditional hierarchy and that the seat belonged to the venerable Duke, Tom's response was a masterclass in modern unearned arrogance. He merely flicked his hand in a dismissive, patronizing gesture, utterly ignoring the courtier while continuing his conversation. Moments later, when the Duke of Kent himself attempted to engage a group of foreign advisors in a historical discussion regarding the evening's international delegation, Tom brutally cut the elderly royal off. He aggressively hijacked the conversation, shifting the focus away from state diplomacy to aggressively pitch his own culinary books and commercial networks, treating the legendary royal Darth like an obsolete relic of a bygone era. Camilla stood merely yards away, watching her son's performance with quiet complacency, viewing his arrogance not as a liability, but as proof of their family's supreme ascension. The retribution for this hubris, however, was as swift as it was absolute. They had profoundly miscalculated the quiet, terrifying vigilance of Princess Anne, the Princess Royal. As the ultimate immutable guardian of the crown's institutional integrity, Anne did not engage in loud confrontations or leak emotional grievances to the press. Instead, she utilized the rigid, unyielding machinery of state protocol to launch a devastating institutional counteroffensive. Upon discovering Camilla's unauthorized manipulation of the seating chart and witnessing Tom's grotesque disrespect toward the Duke of Kent, Princess Anne coordinated a masterstroke of administrative liquidation. Using her absolute authority over royal domestic arrangements, Anne quietly issued a countercommand to the master of the household. She ordered the immediate permanent extraction of Tom Parker B.S. from the sovereign's table, effectively stripping him of any access to the financial titans he sought to exploit. But the true genius of Anne's retaliation lay in its visual execution. She did not merely move his name card. She commanded that the seat originally stolen for him be left completely vacant as guests arrived. Furthermore, she ordered that the Duke of Kent be restored to his rightful historic position of supreme honor directly alongside King Charles. The consequences for Tom Parker B.S. were total and devastatingly public. He was physically intercepted by senior security and palace staff just outside the ballroom doors and quietly informed that his credentials had been reassigned. Strutting toward what he believed would be his commercial coronation, he was instead escorted under the watchful eyes of palace quarters down to the furthest, most insignificant table in the room, forced to sit in humiliating anonymity beside low-level administrative personnel and translated press staff. He was entirely isolated from the levers of international power, his commercial ambitions dead on arrival. As the global broadcast commenced, Queen Camilla walked into the grand ballroom, radiating the illusion of absolute control, only to look down at the sovereign's table and find herself staring into a yawning, deliberate void. Right next to her sat the empty chair, a stark physical manifestation of her institutional powerlessness. It was a terrifying signal to the assembled ambassadors, courtiers, and international dignitaries. The architecture of the state did not belong to her. Her 30-year campaign to dominate the inner workings of the monarchy had been permanently and ruthlessly checked by the immutable laws of royal bloodline protocol, leaving her entirely isolated in the center of a room she could no longer control. The freezing realization that gripped Queen Camilla as she stared at the empty chair beside her was merely the prologue to a multi-layered institutional execution. To understand the absolute finality of this moment, one must pull back the velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace and examine the invisible warring factions that define the modern court. For the past 3 decades, Camilla had played the longest, most patient game of chess in contemporary royal history. She had withstood the scorched earth public fury of the 1990s, outlasted the deep-seated hostility of old guard constitutional purists, and systematically engineered the eraser of Princess Diana's physical and emotional legacy from the palace landscape. Step by careful step, she had replaced independent-minded palace quarters with fiercely loyal press associates, personal confidants, and members of her own non-royal family. By the time the crown was placed upon her head, surrounded by her own grandchildren who possessed not a single drop of royal blood, she genuinely believed the transition of power was absolute. She believed that King Charles III was entirely insulated within her domestic sphere, and that the ancient mechanism of the British monarchy had finally bent to her singular will. In her mind, the grand apparatus of state diplomacy was no longer an instrument of the realm, but a private asset to be leveraged for the permanent advancement of her own bloodline. The urgent drive behind this covert campaign was rooted in a harsh, unyielding reality that Camilla understood all too well. Her constitutional authority was an illusion with a definitive expiration date. Legally, a queen consort holds no sovereign power. She owns none of the palaces. She commands no state offices, and she possesses no independent income capable of sustaining her family's lifestyle once her husband's reign ends. Every ounce of her global geopolitical influence was borrowed capital. This structural vulnerability was the precise catalyst for her high-stakes gamble. Her son, Tom Parker B.S., operated in the precarious, highly volatile world of high-end culinary writing and luxury brand, consulting a career that relied entirely on access to the ultra-wealthy. Camilla recognized that if she could permanently embed Tom within the inner circle of the old aristocracy's financial gatekeepers, she would secure his commercial future long after the crown passed to the next generation. The targets she selected for this integration were the official godparents of Lady Louise Windsor, a carefully curated collective representing the absolute apex of historic prestige and international wealth. By manipulating the hospitality channels to position Tom directly adjacent to Lady Sarah Château and the multi-billionaire Swiss philanthropist Francesca Schwarzenbach, Camilla was attempting a quiet institutional coup. She sought to auction off the sovereign's prestige for private non-royal commercial leverage. She calculated that on the eve of a massive globally televised event, the palace bureaucracy would simply rubber stamp her logistical requests to avoid causing an administrative scene that might disturb the peace of the king. However, her strategic calculus entirely omitted the terrifying silent vigilance of Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, and the formidable solidarity of the godparents' alliance. The coup disintegrated not through loud arguments in the gilded corridors, but through a masterclass in passive, assertive aristocratic resistance. The counterattack began the moment the altered seating manifest was flagged by senior traditionalists within the Lord Chamberlain's office. Princess Anne did not confront Camilla directly. Instead, she quietly convened a private briefing with Lady Sarah Château and Lord Iver Mountbatten. Together, they recognized that this was not an innocent request for family inclusion, but a blatant exploitation of state ritual for private commercial gain, a direct violation of the sacred line dividing royal duty from external business interests. The resistance inside the private VIP reception lounge before the dinner was devastatingly coordinated. When Queen Camilla entered the room, confidently guiding Tom toward the gathering of godparents, she expected immediate compliance. Instead, she walked into a wall of absolute aristocratic frost. Camilla initiated the interaction by introducing Tom with an overly engineered, flattering narrative, highlighting his expertise in luxury markets and culinary arts. Lady Sarah Chitow's response was an institutional assassination disguised as polite etiquette. Lady Sarah did not smile. As Tom eagerly stepped forward to extend his hand, Lady Sarah deliberately executed a traditional cold shoulder maneuver. She stepped back exactly half a pace, her arms remaining folded beneath her historic lace shawl. She looked at Tom with an expression of detached clinical assessment before turning her gaze to Camilla. In a calm, carrying voice that instantly silenced the surrounding quarters, Lady Sarah remarked, "How fascinating, Camilla. I was under the impression that the sovereign's table was reserved for those who serve the state, not those who write cookbooks for profit." The humiliation intensified instantly. Before Tom could attempt to recover his dignity, Lord Ivar Mountbatten intervened to address the flagrant disrespect Tom had shown earlier to the 90-year-old Duke of Kent. Lord Ivar stepped directly into Tom's personal space, his stature completely eclipsing the younger man. With a razor-sharp, quiet fury, Lord Ivar delivered a direct public reprimand that left no room for misinterpretation. "Let us be perfectly clear, Mr. Parker B.S. You are currently occupying a space that you have neither earned nor inherited. Your presence in this palace is a matter of temporary indulgence, not institutional right. When you sit in the chair of a royal granddire who has given half a century of service to this crown, you do not simply show bad manners, dang honor. You will learn to hold your tongue and respect the blood royal, or you will find yourself permanently barred from every reputable house in this kingdom." Tom's face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson as he looked around the room for support, but he found only an impenetrable wall of aristocratic disdain. Francesca Schwarzenbach, the formidable Swiss billionaire and close family friend of the independent royals, completed the psychological liquidation. When Tom, attempting to pivot back to his commercial agenda, tried to casually pitch an exclusive wine consulting project to her, Schwarzenbach didn't even look at the materials his assistant held out. Instead, she maintained steady, icy eye contact with Queen Camilla while calmly reaching down to physically upturn her crystal wine glass on the table in front of her. Turning to her personal aide, Schwarzenbach stated in clear, deliberate tones, "Please have the stewards remove this. I have absolutely no intention of consuming anything recommended or provided by individuals who do not possess a formal state mandate." This coordinated rejection was a total annihilation of the Parker BS brand within the elite circles of international wealth. While this psychological warfare reached its peak in the private quarters, Princess Anne was finalized the administrative trap within the grand ballroom. She had instructed the master of the household to enforce the strict, internationally recognized rules of bloodline precedence. Tom's name card was permanently stripped from the sovereign's table and his assigned seat was moved to table 42, an obscure low-priority table at the absolute rear of the ballroom positioned directly behind a massive marble pillar and surrounded by lower-tier administrative staff and foreign translators. The masterstroke, however, was Anne's directive regarding the physical layout of the main table. She commanded that the space originally stolen for Tom be left entirely vacant, creating a glaring, highly visible void right next to the Queen, while the Duke of Kent was triumphantly restored to his historic position of honor directly on the other side of King Charles. When the massive double doors of the ballroom finally opened and the global broadcast commenced, the trap snapped shut before the eyes of the world. Queen Camilla walked into the room, radiating an illusion of absolute power, only to look down and see the vacant chair, a terrifying physical manifestation of her domestic defeat. Distraught and desperate to salvage her family standing, Camilla executed a silent, pleading maneuver. She turned slightly to her left, looking across the glaring void of the empty chair, searching the face of King Charles III for the familiar defensive intervention that had shielded her from institutional hostility for decades. She fully expected him to pause the procession, to quietly summon the Lord Chamberlain and demand that her son be restored to the table. Instead, she was met with a terrifying running silence. The king did not look at her. He deliberately adjusted the vow of his uniform, smiled warmly, and continued an animated, deeply respectful conversation with Lady Sarah and the Duke of Kent. Charles had made the cold, calculated decision of a sovereign. When presented with the official seating chart, meticulously corrected by Princess Anne according to constitutional precedent, the king realized the profound danger of his wife's overreach. To reverse his sister's orders would be to validate a corrupt use of state hospitality for private commercial gain on live television, an act that would trigger an institutional crisis. The survival of the monarchy and the geopolitical dignity of his own crown were infinitely more important than the commercial ambitions of his wife's family. Camilla's influence over the king ended the exact moment it threatened the stability of his throne. This public execution of protocol was a structural rehearsal for Camilla's ultimate institutional obsolescence. Across the room, sitting in flawless serenity, directly opposite the isolated queen, was Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The visual contrast was devastating. While Camilla had spent weeks desperately manipulating palace channels to artificially elevate her non-royal lineage, Catherine operated with the absolute unshakable confidence of institutional inevitability. The Princess of Wales did not need to force her family into the center of power because she was the future of it. Dressed in the historic jewels of the state, Catherine embodied the exact dignity and continuity that the crown demanded. The court factions, the foreign ambassadors, and the senior palace advisors read these subtle ritualistic shifts with absolute clarity. In the aristocratic world, a modified seating plan and a purposefully empty chair are never accidental logistical errors. They are clear, definitive broadcasts regarding the true location of power. The servants and diplomatic staff who had once rushed to accommodate Camilla's every whim now quietly shifted their focus. They were no longer looking to the current temporary reign. Instead, they were silently aligning their loyalties with Prince William and the Princess of Wales. As the state banquet progressed, the room filled with the clinking of crystal and the low hum of international diplomacy. But Queen Camilla was left in a state of profound psychological isolation. The grand illusion had shattered, leaving behind the cold reality of her position. She had won her long, bitter war to wear the crown, surviving public fury and institutional resistance. But in her desperate attempt to commercialize the throne, she had permanently lost the kingdom. She was left to endure the remaining years of her husband's reign, sitting at a table she could not control, surrounded by an administrative apparatus that answered only to her strategic rivals, trapped in a reality she could no longer manipulate.